What would you do if the law told you that everything you built didn't belong to you? Just because of who you are? In the harsh frontier of the West, Nora Calloway faces exactly that. A widow, a mother, a fighter, and today, she receives a notice that could destroy everything. But hidden beneath this battle lies a past, a betrayal, and a truth that could change everything. Stay with me, because this story is far from what it seems.
4 in the morning, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones. That is when Nora Calloway's day began. Not with a hot cup of coffee by a warm fire. No, it began out in the drafty barn, up to her elbows in hay and mud, helping a frightened heifer bring a new calf into the world. You have to understand something about the frontier. It didn't care about your past. It didn't care if you were a man or a woman. It only cared if you quit. And Nora, she never quit. Let's look back for a second. 10 years ago, Tennessee, 1872. She had stood on a porch and said a tearful goodbye to a cowboy, a man who promised the moon, rode west, and never sent a word. When she realized she was carrying his child, she had a choice to make. Face the total ruin of a cruel, judgmental society, or survive. She chose to survive. She married Edmund Calloway, a quiet, decent man. He needed a wife to file a homestead claim. She needed a name to protect her unborn son. Edmund gave her that shield. But make no mistake, Nora built this farm. When they arrived in Harlan Creek in 1875, it was nothing but dirt and sagebrush. Nora was the one who dug the irrigation trenches. She hauled the rocks. She carved water lines right out of the stubborn clay. Her hands, her sweat. Edmund was the name on the paper, sure. But Nora was the beating heart of the land. Fast forward to this morning, March 1882. The calf is breathing steady. Nora washes her hands at the pump. She walks into the kitchen. And there it sits, waiting on the wooden table, an eviction notice from the Territorial Land Office. Now the laws back then were blind, willfully blind. They did not recognize a wife's sweat equity. Edmund had passed away 2 years ago from the fever, and according to the men in suits, this land now belonged to the territory, because in their eyes, a woman couldn't hold a deed alone. Nora doesn't cry. Tears don't plow the fields. She walks over to the old cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She lifts the heavy lid. She's looking for her tax receipts. But as she sifts through the papers, her fingers brush against something soft, a piece of faded blue silk ribbon, a gift from a cowboy, 10 winters ago. She holds it, just for a heartbeat. Then she tucks it away, deep at the bottom of the chest. She doesn't have time for ghosts. She has a farm to save. Nora pulls out her farm ledgers, 7 thick books. Every drop of rain, every bushel of wheat, every penny spent, all written down in her neat handwriting. Then she hears soft footsteps on the floorboards. Owen, 9 years old. He rubs his hazel eyes. He has a stubborn, furrowed brow, the exact face of the man she is trying to forget. Owen sees the stark official paper on the table. He looks up at his mother. "Are they taking the farm, Mama?" Nora pulls out a chair. She sits down, bringing herself right to his eye level. She takes his small, warm hands in her calloused ones. "Listen to me, Owen," Nora says. Her voice is steady, clear as a church bell. "I want you to learn a lesson today about human rights and dignity. The men out there, the ones who wrote this paper, they will try to tell you that a woman does not have the same rights as a man. They will say a woman cannot own property, cannot govern her own life, and cannot stand as an equal. They are entirely wrong." Owen listens, not blinking. "Equality is not a favor that a politician grants you," Nora tells him, emphasizing every word. "It is a fundamental human right. You must always remember to measure a person's worth by their kindness, their character, and the honesty of their labor. Never, ever judge someone's value or strip them of respect based on their gender. Women and men are equal partners in this world. They deserve equal protection, equal respect, and equal freedom. She lets go of his hands and picks up the thick stack of ledgers. No unjust law will ever erase the sweat I poured into this soil, she says, standing up. We are going to fight this, not with anger, but with the truth. She packs the ledgers into her leather satchel. She doesn't know what is waiting for her in town. She doesn't know that a new land commissioner has just arrived. And she certainly doesn't know that the cowboy she waited 10 winters for is the man sitting behind the desk. Cole Hargrove rode into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday. He didn't come looking for ghosts. He came looking for paper. Paper was safe. Paper was predictable. 10 winters ago, a woman had broken him in half back in Tennessee. He had poured his last dime into a patch of dirt out west. He wrote 12 letters. He waited. And when the silence finally deafened him, he boxed up his heart and traded it for the law. Now he was 38, a territorial land commissioner, a man who believed that if it wasn't written down in black ink, it simply didn't exist. His first meeting was with Silas Pratt, the head of the settlement board. Pratt was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes. He poured Cole a glass of cheap whiskey and laid out the town's problems. He kept the Calloway farm for last. He tossed it on the desk like an afterthought. Tragic case, Pratt said, shaking his head. Widow Calloway. Lost her husband 2 years back. She's trying to hold on to the homestead, but you know how it is. A woman alone out here. She's overwhelmed, confused by the paperwork. The land needs a man's hand, Mr. Hargrove. It's for her own good that the board takes it back. Cole took a sip of the whiskey. It burned going down. He didn't argue. He had seen it 100 times in Billings, widows in over their heads, land going back to the territory. I'll review the file tomorrow, Cole said. Cold, professional. The next morning, Cole sat in the makeshift land office. It was a dusty room above the general store. He had his files stacked, his pens lined up. A knock at the door. I'll be with you in a moment, Cole said, not looking up. He was busy tracing a boundary line on a map. I brought my ledgers. The pen slipped from Cole's fingers. It hit the floorwood with a sharp crack. That voice. It was a voice he had heard in his dreams for 3,650 nights. A voice he had tried to drown in whiskey, bury in law books, and ride away from. But there it was, right in the room. Cole lifted his head, slowly. She stood in the doorway. Nora. Time is a cruel thief. But it hadn't stolen her pride. She wore a faded cotton dress, dusted with the dry earth of Montana. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Her hands, once soft in the Tennessee summer, were calloused and scarred. But she stood straight, her chin tilted up. Cole couldn't breathe. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of air. She stared at him. The shock registered in her eyes, flashing hot, then immediately icing over. She thought he had abandoned her. He thought she had sold him out for a richer man. A decade of unspoken betrayal hung in the 3 yards of space between them. Neither of them said a word. The silence was heavier than a collapsed mine shaft. Then a small shadow moved out from behind Nora's skirt. A boy. He stepped forward. He was wearing faded overalls, clutching a wooden toy horse. He looked up at the strange man behind the desk. Cole looked at the boy, and the floor dropped out from under him. The boy had hazel eyes, sharp and observant. He had a stubborn, furrowed brow. He had Cole's jawline. Cole did the math in his head, a brutal, lightning-fast calculation. 9 years old, 10 winters ago. Cole's hands started to shake. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. He was looking at a ghost of himself. "Take a seat, Mrs. Calloway," Cole managed to say. His voice was gravel. He hated how formal it sounded. But the law was his armor. He put it on. Nora did not sit. She walked to the desk. She dropped a heavy stack of leather-bound books right on top of his territorial maps. "I am not here for pleasantries, Mr. Hargrove," Nora said. Her voice did not shake. "Silas Pratt tells me the law says I don't exist. He tells me my rights vanished the day my husband died. So I am here to correct his education. And yours if need be." Cole stared at the ledgers, then back at her. "The law is clear regarding the title, Nora. If Edmund's name is the only one on the deed—" "Stop right there," Nora cut him off. She pointed a scarred finger at the desk. "You are an agent of the government, so I need you to hear this clearly. The right to own the fruits of my own labor is not a male privilege. It is a fundamental human right. Justice is not a game of who holds the pen. It is a matter of who bleeds for the soil. I am a human being. You're equal under God and the law, and I expect to be treated with the exact same legal dignity as any man in this territory." Cole swallowed hard. He looked at the boy. Owen was watching his mother with total admiration. "I have to follow this procedure," Cole said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have to inspect the property." "Then inspect it," Nora said. She placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "But do not come to my home expecting to find a victim. We are done here." She turned. She walked out. The boy followed her, looking back at Cole one last time. When the door clicked shut, Cole buried his face in his hands. 10 winters. He had waited 10 winters. And she had brought him the sky, the stars, and a truth he didn't know how to carry. The sun was high and punishing when Cole rode out to the Calloway farm. He didn't want to go. Every mile was a physical ache. He wanted to find a failing homestead. He wanted to find a farm drowning in weeds and rot. It would make things easier. It would prove she had made a mistake. It would prove she needed him, or at least needed saving. But Cole broke the ridge, looked down into the valley, and his heart sank. It was magnificent. Acres of golden wheat swaying in the wind, fences standing straight and true, a complex hand-dug irrigation trench pulling clear water down from the creek, feeding the soil perfectly. It was the best piece of land he had seen in the entire territory. He rode down into the yard. Nora was out by the barn. She was swinging a heavy iron hoe, breaking up a patch of hard clay. She didn't stop when he rode up. She didn't even look his way. Cole dismounted. He tied his horse to the post. The bitterness rose up in his throat. Bitter that he hadn't been here to build this. Bitter that another man had given her this life. "Edmund Calloway knew what he was doing," Cole said loudly, his voice carrying a jagged edge. "I'll give him that. A man builds an irrigation system like this, he leaves quite a legacy." Nora stopped. The hoe buried itself deep in the dirt. She turned around. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She walked right up to the fence line, looking at Cole with eyes that could cut glass. "Listen to me, Mr. Hargrove," Nora said, slowly, so there could be no misunderstanding. "Edmund was a good man. He gave my son a name when society would have ruined us both. But do not stand on my land and give a dead man the credit for my broken back." Cole flinched. "I dug those trenches," Nora said, pointing a finger toward the creek, "with a pickaxe in my bare hands. I crossbred that wheat when the first crop failed. I set those fence posts in the freezing rain. Society might be eager to credit the man, but true equality demands the truth. Do not diminish a woman's life work just because you harbor anger toward her. My labor is equal to yours. My intelligence is equal to yours. Acknowledge it." Cole couldn't speak. He looked at her hands. He saw the calluses, the old blisters, the undeniable truth written in her skin. Before he could answer, the wooden gate creaked open. Mari Tuck walked into the yard. Mari was 67, the town midwife, the unofficial doctor. She had eyes that had seen 1,000 births and 100 deaths. She carried a basket of herbs on her arm. She didn't like outsiders, and she didn't like men in suits. "You must be the commissioner," Mari said. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves. I am, Cole said, tipping his hat. Cole Hargrove. Mari didn't smile. She walked right up to him. She was a foot shorter, but she made Cole feel small. I delivered that boy, Mari said, nodding toward the house where Owen was reading on the porch. I sat with Nora when Edmund died. I've watched her bleed into this dirt for 7 years. So I want to tell you something, Mr. Hargrove, and I expect you to listen. Cole stood still. I'm listening, ma'am. You represent the law, Mari said. You think justice is found in a courthouse or on a piece of paper. It isn't. Justice is the recognition of equal human worth. When you allow a corrupt settlement board to erase a mother's labor, you don't just steal her farm, you trample on the very foundation of human dignity. She stepped closer, pointing a crooked finger at his chest. A society that refuses to grant a woman the right to own her own survival is a society that has lost its soul. Human rights do not depend on gender. They depend on breath and bone and labor. She fought this wilderness alone. She didn't ask for a handout. She asked for her rightful due. So open your eyes, Commissioner. Do not be the man who uses the law to blindfold the truth. Mari didn't wait for a response. She walked past him, heading toward the kitchen door. Cole stood alone in the yard. The wind whipped through the wheat. Nora had gone back to swinging the hoe. Every strike of the iron against the earth sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. He rode back to town in silence. That night, Cole sat in his rented room above the diner. The kerosene lamp threw long shadows against the peeling wallpaper. He opened the leather-bound ledger Nora had dropped on his desk. He turned the pages. 1875, 1876, 1877. There was no mention of Edmund's labor. There was only Nora's handwriting, slanted, hurried, tired, March 12th, dug the North Trench, hands bleeding, ground frozen, must finish before thaw, July 4th, heat unbearable, Edmund resting, I repaired the barn roof. 3 shingles left, February 14th, 1880, Edmund is gone, God rest his soul, ground too hard for a deep grave. I will dig until it is done. Cole closed the book. He pressed his palms against his eyes. She hadn't married for wealth. She hadn't married for ease. She had married to survive a world that gave women no choices. And then she had built an empire out of dirt with her own 2 hands. Cole reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn piece of paper. It was the eviction notice Silas Pratt had drafted. It was legal. It was standard. And it was a profound, unforgivable violation of human rights. He held the paper over the glass chimney of the kerosene lamp. He watched the edge curl. He watched it turn brown, then black. The flame caught. He dropped the burning paper into the metal wash basin on his nightstand. He watched the law turn to ash. Tomorrow he wouldn't be a commissioner reading a file. Tomorrow he would be a man, fighting for the mother of his son. Foster's Diner was the loudest place in Harlan Creek. It smelled like stale coffee, bacon grease, and wet wool. Men came here after a long day in the dirt. They came to eat heavy food and talk loud. They didn't come to listen. Cole sat in the corner booth. He nursed a black coffee. He was watching the room. Silas Pratt sat at the center table. He held court. He had 3 members of the settlement board with him. Pratt was a man who loved the sound of his own voice, and tonight he wanted everyone to hear it. Nora walked in. She didn't look at Pratt. She didn't look at Cole. She just walked to the counter. She needed to pick up a sack of flour and some salt. The room went quiet for a second. Then Pratt leaned back in his chair. He hooked his thumbs into his vest. Well, if it isn't the widow Calloway, Pratt said. His voice carried over the clinking of forks. I hear you paid a visit to the new commissioner today, trying to understand the paperwork, were you? Nora kept her back to him. She handed the shopkeeper her coins. It's a shame, Pratt continued, looking around the room, inviting the other men to laugh. It really is. A woman trying to run a wheat farm all by her lonesome. It goes against the natural order of things. A woman's mind isn't built for legal matters. It isn't built for land management. That is why the law requires a man's name on the deed. It protects women from their own lack of intellect. A few men chuckled. Cole's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He felt the anger rising in his chest, hot and fast. He almost stood up, but Nora didn't need him to stand up. She turned around. She picked up her heavy sack of flour. She rested it on her hip. Then she walked right up to Silas Pratt's table. She looked down at him. Pratt stopped smiling. "Mr. Pratt," Nora said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It cut through that diner like a sharpened axe. "You talk about the natural order," Nora said, "but what you really mean is control. I want you to listen to me very carefully, and I want every man in this room to hear it." The diner was dead silent. You could hear the wind howling outside the glass. "The right to own property is not a male privilege," Nora said, speaking slowly, emphasizing every single word. "It is a fundamental human right. The right to pursue happiness, to keep the money you earn, and to own the land you bleed on. These are rights granted by God, not by men in suits. To say a woman lacks the intellect to own land is not a law. It is a lie. It is an excuse used by greedy men to steal what they did not build." Pratt's face turned red. He opened his mouth to speak, but Nora didn't let him. "I have managed my farm better than half the men in this room," she said, her eyes sweeping across the diner. "I pay my taxes. I dig my own trenches. Equality under the law is the only thing that separates a civilized town from a pack of wolves. You are trying to steal my property simply because I am a woman, and I am telling you right here in front of God and everyone else, I will not yield my humanity or my rights to your paperwork." She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned and walked out the door. The bell jingled into the cold night. Pratt sat there, humiliated. He looked over at Cole, expecting the commissioner to agree with him. Cole just stared back, his eyes dead flat. He dropped a coin on the table and walked out. The cold air hit Cole's face. He walked to the livery. He saddled his horse. He couldn't sit in that room anymore. He couldn't pretend to be neutral. He had watched her stand up against a room full of men. He had seen the fire in her, the exact same fire he fell in love with 10 winters ago. He rode out to the Calloway farm. It was late. The moon was a thin sliver of silver. He tied his horse to the fence. He walked up to the porch. A lantern was burning in the window. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. A moment later, it opened. Nora stood there. She had taken off her apron. Her hair was down, falling across her shoulders. She looked tired, but she didn't look defeated. "Commissioner," she said. Her voice was guarded. "It's late." "I didn't come as the commissioner," Cole said. His voice was thick. He took off his hat. He held it in his hands. "Then why did you come?" she asked. Cole looked at her. 10 years of pain, 10 years of silence. It all pushed up against his ribs. He had to know. He couldn't go another day without knowing. "Why did they come back, Nora?" Cole asked. His voice broke on her name. Nora frowned. "Why did what come back?" "My letters," Cole said. He stepped closer. The porch boards creaked. 10 winters ago, I rode out west. I promised I would send for you as soon as I had the money. I worked myself to the bone. I bought a piece of land. I wrote you 12 letters, 12, and every single one came back. Return to sender. Why did you send them back?" Nora stared at him. The color drained completely from her face. She gripped the door frame. Her knuckles went white. "I never sent them back," she whispered. The silence between them was deafening. The wind stopped blowing. The world just stopped. "What do you mean?" Cole asked. His heart started hammering against his ribs. "I never got a single letter, Cole," Nora said. Her voice was shaking now. "I waited. I went to the post office every day, for a year. They told me nothing came. I thought you forgot about me. I thought you found a new life and left me behind." Cole stared at her. He felt physically sick. "If you didn't send them back, who did?" Nora closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. My father, she said. The words tasted like ash. Cole stood frozen on the porch. The pieces began to fall into place. A cruel, terrible puzzle. The kitchen was warm. The iron stove was still throwing heat from dinner. Cole sat at the wooden table. Nora sat across from him. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the grain of the wood, not at him. He burned them, Nora said. Her voice was hollow, empty. My father. He was the postmaster back in Tennessee. I realize it now. He intercepted your letters. He stamped them returned and sent them back to you. The ones he didn't send back, he threw in the fire. Cole felt a rage he had never known before. It was a cold, blinding fury. Why? Why would he do that to you? Nora looked up. Her eyes were red, but the tears had stopped. Because you were poor, Cole, she said simply. You were a cowboy with big dreams and empty pockets. He wanted me to marry a merchant. He wanted me to marry into money. You have to understand how the world treats women. Society tells a woman she is property. First, she belongs to her father. He decides who she marries. Then she belongs to her husband. She is never allowed to belong to herself. Cole shook his head. I would have come back for you, if I had known. But you didn't know, Nora said. And I didn't know. All I knew was that I was alone and I was pregnant. The word hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Cole stopped breathing. He looked toward the hallway, toward the small bedroom where Owen was sleeping. Owen? Cole whispered. Nora nodded slowly. Yes. Cole leaned back in his chair. He rubbed a hand over his face. The weight of 10 years crashed down on him all at once. 9 years of his son's life, gone. Stolen by a cruel man in Tennessee. Why didn't you tell me today? Cole asked. His voice was ragged. When I came to the office. Why didn't you say he was mine? Nora sat up straight. She looked him right in the eye. Because I needed you to understand something about survival, Nora said. I want to be very clear about this, Cole. Listen to me. When I realized I was carrying a child out of wedlock, my father threatened to throw me out into the street. Society would have ruined me. They would have called my son a bastard. They would have spit on him. A woman without a man to claim her was treated like dirt. She leaned forward across the table. I married Edmund Calloway to protect my child, Nora stated, her voice full of fierce pride. Edmund was a kind man. He knew I didn't love him the way a wife should. But he gave Owen his name. He gave us a shield against a cruel world. I made a choice to survive. Do you understand? I am not ashamed of what I did. I protected my son. Cole looked at her. He didn't see the young girl he had left in Tennessee. He saw a warrior, a mother who had walked through fire. I'm not judging you, Nora, Cole said softly. I'm so damn sorry. I don't want your pity, Cole, Nora said. She pulled back slightly. And I don't want you to think that because Owen is your blood, you have a right to step in and take over. You cannot claim us like lost property. A child is a human being, not a possession. And so am I. We do not belong to you. Cole nodded. He respected her too much to argue. I know, Cole said. I know I lost the right to be his father 10 years ago. You didn't lose the right, Nora corrected him gently. It was stolen from you, just like my choices were stolen from me. But we cannot change the past. We can only deal with the paper sitting on your desk in town. Cole's mind snapped back to the present, to Silas Pratt. Pratt is making a move, Cole said, his tone shifting back to the commissioner. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He came to my office late this afternoon. He brought 3 affidavits, signed by your neighbors, Lars Eriksson and 2 others. They swore under oath that this farm is abandoned and mismanaged. Nora's eyes narrowed. Lars signed that? After I helped deliver his mare last spring? Pratt bought them off, Cole said. Or threatened them. Either way, they signed. Pratt is calling an emergency meeting of the settlement board for Friday. He is going to force a vote to revoke your deed. He expects me to sign off on it immediately. Nora stood up. She walked over to the stove. She grabbed a rag and wiped down the cold iron. It was a nervous habit, a way to keep her hands moving. If you don't sign it, Nora said, keeping her back to him, if you side with me, Pratt will destroy you. He'll write to the territorial governor. He'll say you're corrupt. He'll ruin your career. I don't care about my career, Cole said. He stood up. He walked across the kitchen. He stopped a few feet behind her. Nora, he said softly. She turned around. 10 winters ago I failed you, Cole said. He looked her right in the eyes, no hiding. I let distance and silence beat me. I should have ridden back to Tennessee. I should have burned that post office to the ground until I found you. I didn't. I gave up. And you had to face the world alone. He reached out. He didn't touch her. He just held his hand open between them. I can't give you back the last 10 years, Cole said. His voice was steady now. I can't just step in and be a father to a boy who doesn't know me. I know that. But I can do this. I can use the law. Not to oppress you, but to protect you. Nora looked at his open hand. She didn't take it. But she didn't step away. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to do my job, Cole said. A hard, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth. Pratt thinks the law is a weapon he can use against women and poor folks. I'm going to teach him that the law works both ways. But I need time. How much time? I need to delay Pratt's meeting, Cole said, his mind racing, building a strategy. If I rule in your favor tomorrow, Pratt will appeal it immediately. He will claim I have a personal bias. He'll dig into our past. We can't let him control the narrative. So what is the plan? Nora asked. You don't wait for his meeting, Cole said. He looked at her ledgers stacked on the counter. You beat him to the punch. You have those ledgers. You have the truth. You need to make this public, before Pratt can lock the doors and vote in secret. Nora understood immediately. The fire came back into her eyes. I'll go to Reverend Aldgate, she said. I'll call a town hall at the church. Pratt doesn't own the church. The Reverend will let me speak. Exactly, Cole said. You present your case to the people. Make them look you in the eye. Make them listen to the truth. And while you do that, I am going to tear Silas Pratt's history apart. I am going to find every dirty land deal he's ever made. Cole picked up his hat from the table. He put it on, pulling the brim down low. I'm not leaving you this time, Nora, Cole said. You fought for this land, you bled for it. And I swear to God I will make sure the law recognizes you as the rightful owner, not as a widow, not as a ward of the state, as an equal human being. He turned and walked out the door. Nora stood in the kitchen. She listened to the sound of his horse riding away into the dark. For the first time in 10 winters, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She walked over to the bedroom door. She pushed it open softly. Owen was asleep, tangled in his blankets. She sat on the edge of the bed. She brushed the hair out of his hazel eyes. We are going to be all right, my boy, she whispered in the dark. Your father is finally home. Silas Pratt did not wait. Men like Pratt never do. They smell hesitation the way a wolf smells blood on the snow. He knew Cole was digging into his past. He knew the widow Calloway was not going to break easily. So he decided to force the issue. He called an emergency meeting of the settlement board. Thursday afternoon. 3 o'clock sharp. The air in the board office was thick. Cigar smoke hung near the ceiling like a dirty cloud. 5 men sat around a heavy oak table. Silas Pratt sat at the head. Cole Hargrove sat at the far end. Cole kept his hands flat on the wood. He kept his face like stone. Inside, his blood was boiling. Pratt cleared his throat. He tapped a stack of papers on the table. Gentlemen, Pratt began. His voice was smooth, too smooth. We are here to resolve the issue of the Calloway homestead. It is a matter of public safety and economic stability. 3 of her closest neighbors have signed affidavits. They swear the land is mismanaged. The irrigation ditches are a risk to the town's water supply. Pratt looked down the table at Cole. As the territorial commissioner, Mr. Hargrove, Pratt said, we require your immediate signature. Revoke the deed, return the land to the board. We have a buyer lined up, a man who knows how to work the soil. All eyes turned to Cole. It was a trap, a perfect steel-jawed trap. If Cole sided with Nora right then and there, Pratt would cry foul. He would accuse Cole of personal bias. He would send a wire to the governor by sundown. Pratt would say the commissioner was compromised by a pretty widow. The territory would send a new commissioner, a man Pratt could easily buy. And Nora would lose everything. Cole looked at the affidavits. He recognized Lars Eriksson's signature. It made him sick. I cannot sign this today, Cole said. His voice was perfectly level. Pratt's smile tightened. And why is that, Commissioner? The paperwork is in order. The town demands it. Because the law requires due process, Cole said, meeting Pratt's eyes. He didn't blink. I am an agent of the federal government, Mr. Pratt. I do not rubber stamp evictions on hearsay. I will conduct a formal review of these affidavits. I require 7 days. Pratt leaned forward. The friendly mask slipped. 7 days is a long time, Mr. Hargrove. A lot can happen. People might start asking questions about your competence. Let them ask, Cole said. He stood up. He picked up his hat. 7 days, gentlemen. Do not touch that land until I render my decision. If you do, I will have federal marshals down here before the dust settles. Cole walked out. He hit the boardwalk and took a deep breath of the cold air. He had bought time. But time wasn't going to save Nora. Not unless he found the hard proof of Pratt's corruption. News travels fast in the small town. By 4 o'clock, the whole of Harlan Creek knew the board was moving to take the farm. Out on the homestead, Nora got the news from Mari Tuck. Mari had ridden out in a hurry. Her old mare was breathing hard. Mari stood in the kitchen and told Nora everything, about the affidavits, about the emergency meeting, about Cole asking for 7 days. Nora didn't panic. She didn't cry. She walked over to the wash basin. She scrubbed the dirt from her hands. She dried them on a towel. 7 days, Nora murmured. She looked out the window. Pratt won't wait 7 days. He'll find a judge in Billings to override the commissioner. He'll send men to lock my gates. What are you going to do? Mari asked. The old woman looked worried, truly worried. Nora turned around. Her eyes were dark and hard. I am not going to wait for a man to save me, Nora said. Not Cole, and certainly not the territory. Silas Pratt thinks he controls the law because he controls the board. But he doesn't control the people. Nora walked into her bedroom. She grabbed her leather satchel. She packed her 7 ledgers inside. They were heavy. They weighed as much as a cord of wood. But she carried them easily. Watch Owen for me, Mari, Nora said, walking past her toward the door. I have an errand to run in town. Nora rode straight to the Harlan Creek Church. It was a simple, white clapboard building. The paint was peeling. The bell in the tower was rusted. But it was the only building in town Silas Pratt didn't own. Reverend Aldgate was sweeping the front steps. He was a good man, but he was a quiet man. He liked to keep the peace. Nora tied her horse. She walked up the wooden steps. Good afternoon, Nora, the Reverend said, leaning on his broom. He looked uncomfortable. He had heard the rumors. Reverend, Nora said. She didn't stop to talk about the weather. I need to use the church tomorrow night. I'm calling a town hall meeting. Aldgate frowned. He looked around as if Pratt might be hiding in the bushes. Nora, the church is a place of worship. It isn't a place for political disputes. I know the board is causing you trouble. But this is a legal matter." Nora stopped. She looked at the Reverend. She didn't raise her voice, but it commanded the space entirely. "Reverend Aldgate," Nora said, "you stand in that pulpit every Sunday. You preach about faith. You preach about compassion, but I want you to hear me clearly today." She stepped closer. "Faith without justice is just an empty hymn," Nora said. "It means nothing. True religion, true faith, is about defending the vulnerable. It is about recognizing the equal dignity of every human soul. When men use corrupt laws to steal from a widow, that is not a political dispute. That is a moral failing. It is a sin against the very community you are supposed to shepherd." Aldgate gripped the broom handle. He was listening. "The rights of a woman are not secondary to the rights of a man," Nora continued, her voice ringing with absolute conviction. "The right to own property, the right to live free from extortion, these are basic human rights. If this church cannot open its doors to defend those rights, then it is just an empty building made of dead wood. Tomorrow night, I will stand in this church. I will defend my humanity. Are you going to lock the doors on me?" The Reverend stared at her. He saw the sheer, unbending truth in her eyes. He slowly lowered the broom. He swallowed hard. "The doors will be open, Nora," he said quietly. 7 o'clock. I will ring the bell myself." Nora nodded. "Thank you, Reverend." She walked back to her horse. She had laid the groundwork. Now she just had to face the storm. Friday night, 7 o'clock. The rusted bell in the church tower rang out across Harlan Creek. It echoed off the mountains. It drifted over the plains. People came. They came out of curiosity. They came out of guilt. They came because there was nothing else to do on a Friday night. By 7:15, the wooden pews were packed. Men took off their hats. Women pulled their shawls tight against the evening chill. Silas Pratt sat in the front row. He had his board members with him. He looked confident. He looked like a man watching a play he had already written the ending to. Cole Hargrove stood in the back, near the heavy oak doors. He leaned against the wall. He wore a dark suit. He kept his eyes on the pulpit. At 7:30, Reverend Aldgate stood up. He said a brief, nervous prayer. Then he stepped aside. Nora walked up the center aisle. She didn't look like a victim. She wore her best dress, dark wool, high collar. Her hair was pinned back tight. She carried her heavy leather satchel. She walked up the wooden steps to the pulpit. She set the satchel down. The thud echoed in the silent room. Nora looked out at the faces. She saw Lars Eriksson looking at his boots. She saw Mari Tuck smiling faintly. She saw Pratt sneering. And in the very back, she saw Cole. "Thank you all for coming," Nora began. Her voice was calm. It carried easily to the back row. "I am not here tonight to preach to you, and I am certainly not here to beg for your pity. I am here to present the truth." She opened the satchel. She pulled out the 7 heavy ledgers. She stacked them on the pulpit. "3 days ago," Nora said, "I was handed an eviction notice. Silas Pratt and the settlement board claim my farm is abandoned. They claim it is mismanaged. They claim that because my husband is dead, I lack the legal capacity and the intellect to hold the deed to the land I live on." Pratt shifted in his seat. He looked annoyed. "I want to address that claim," Nora said. She opened the top ledger. "This is my record for the year 1876, page 42, May the 12th. Broke ground on the North Irrigation Trench. Dug 10 yards, hands bleeding. Will finish tomorrow. There is no mention of a man helping me, because there was no man helping me." She opened another book. 1879, a year of severe drought, Nora read. Crossbred the winter wheat with the red strain. Harvest yielded 40 bushels an acre, the highest in the valley. I did the math. I managed the soil. I kept this town fed when the supply train stopped coming. She closed the book. She looked right at Silas Pratt. "I built that farm. Nora said, her voice rising, filling the vaulted ceiling of the church. I watered it with my sweat. I paid the taxes with my labor. I want everyone in this room to understand a fundamental truth tonight. A woman's worth is not defined by who she belongs to. It is defined by her actions, by her labor, by her character. Nora gripped the edges of the pulpit. Property ownership is not a gendered privilege, she stated. It is a human right. To tell a woman she cannot own the fruits of her own labor is to treat her like a slave. It strips her of her dignity. And any law that supports that theft is not a law at all. It is tyranny dressed up in a suit and tie. Pratt couldn't take it anymore. He jumped up from the front pew. This is ridiculous, Pratt shouted, turning to face the crowd. This is exactly what I mean. She is emotional. She is irrational. The law clearly states that a deed requires a competent male signature. The board has already decided. The land reverts to the territory. This meeting is over. The crowd started to murmur. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The meeting is not over, Mr. Pratt. The voice came from the back of the church. It was deep. It was absolute. The crowd parted. Cole Hargrove walked down the center aisle. He didn't look like a heartbroken cowboy anymore. He looked like the full weight of the federal government. He walked past the pews. He stopped right in front of Silas Pratt. Cole turned to face the congregation. He looked up at Nora. He gave her a single, barely perceptible nod. Then he looked at the town. My name is Cole Hargrove, he said loudly. I am the Territorial Land Commissioner, and I have spent the last 3 days conducting an independent investigation into the Calloway homestead. Pratt's face went white. You said you needed 7 days. I lied, Cole said coldly, not even looking at him. Cole addressed the room. I have examined Mrs. Calloway's ledgers, Cole said. I have surveyed her property, and my conclusion is simple. The Calloway farm is the most productive, well-managed homestead in Harlan Creek. The affidavits claiming otherwise, signed by some men in this very room, are pure perjury. A few men in the crowd slumped down in their seats. Lars Eriksson looked like he wanted to vanish into the floorboards. But more importantly, Cole continued, his voice ringing with authority, I want to speak to the law. Mr. Pratt loves the law. He hides behind it. But he doesn't understand it. The law was not written to protect those who exploit its loopholes. The law was written to protect basic human rights. Cole pointed up at Nora. This woman is an equal citizen of this territory, Cole declared. Equal in labor, equal in intellect, equal in rights. To deny her ownership of the land she built with her bare hands is a violation of human decency. Justice demands that labor is rewarded, regardless of whether those hands belong to a man or a woman. Cole reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope. Furthermore, Cole said, his voice turning deadly cold. While I was investigating the farm, I also investigated Mr. Pratt. I pulled the property records from Billings. I have here documented proof of 3 separate occasions where Silas Pratt used the exact same tactic. He targeted widows. He claimed their land was abandoned. He seized the deeds and then sold the land to a dummy corporation that he secretly owns. The church erupted. Men started shouting. Women gasped. Pratt backed up. He bumped into the wooden altar rail. That's a lie. Those are forged documents. They are territorial records, Cole said, his voice cutting through the noise. Signed and stamped. I wired copies to the federal marshal in Billings this afternoon. They will be here to arrest you by Monday morning, Silas. Pratt looked around. He looked at his board members. They were already backing away from him. He looked at the town. The people he had bullied and stolen from for years were staring at him with pure hatred. Pratt didn't say another word. He pushed his way past Cole. He ran down the side aisle and out the door of the church. Silence fell over the room again. Cole looked up at the pulpit. Nora was looking down at him. Her eyes were shining, but she didn't cry. She stood tall, proud. As my final act concerning this matter, Cole said to the crowd, I am officially directing the Territorial Office to issue a new deed. It will grant full, independent, and undisputed ownership of the farm to Nora Elizabeth Calloway. The church stayed quiet for a long moment. It was a lot to take in. The fall of a tyrant, the victory of a widow. Then Mari Tuck stood up in the third row. She didn't clap, she didn't cheer. She just looked at Nora, and she nodded her head in deep respect. Then Lars Eriksson stood up. He took off his hat, and he held it over his heart. One by one, the town of Harlan Creek stood up. They stood up for the woman who had fought the wilderness, fought the law, and won. Nora looked out at them. She placed her scarred hands flat on her ledgers. She had written her own name into the history of this town, and no man, no law, and no winter would ever be able to erase it again. The morning after the town hall was quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a funeral. It was the clean, washed-out quiet that comes right after a violent storm. The air smelled like wet pine and turned earth. Cole Hargrove rode out to the Calloway farm just after sunrise. He didn't wear his town suit. He wore faded denim, leather boots scuffed white at the toes, a canvas jacket, and tied to the back of his saddle was a heavy wooden tripod and a brass transit level. He didn't come to talk. He came to work. Silas Pratt was sitting in a jail cell in Billings by now. The board was shattered. But Cole knew how the law worked. The law had a short memory. Men would eventually forget the truth that was spoken in that church. They would try to test the borders of this farm again. Cole was going to make sure they couldn't. He was going to survey every single inch of the property line. He was going to drive iron stakes deep into the bedrock. He was going to make Nora's claim bulletproof. He set up the tripod at the edge of the east pasture. The brass was cold. He adjusted the glass lens. He leveled the air bubble. He was so focused he didn't hear the footsteps in the tall grass. "What is that?" Cole looked up. Owen stood a few feet away. The boy was wearing a wool coat that was a size too big. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He was looking at the brass instrument with pure, unblinking curiosity. Cole felt a sudden sharp ache in his chest. His son, 9 years old, standing right in front of him. Cole didn't rush it. He didn't drop to his knees and cry. The frontier didn't respect men who let their emotions run wild. You had to earn your ground, inch by inch. "It's a transit level," Cole said. His voice was steady. "It helps a man draw straight lines on the earth. It measures the angles. It tells you exactly where your property begins and where it ends." Owen took a step closer. He squinted at the brass knobs. "My mother already knows where the property ends," Owen said. He sounded defensive, protective. "She marked the trees by the creek." "I know she did," Cole said. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "Your mother knows this land better than anyone alive. But the men in the cities, the men who write the laws, they don't look at trees. They look at numbers on a piece of paper. I am here to turn your mother's hard work into numbers they cannot argue with." Owen seemed to accept that. He nodded. "Can I look?" "Come here," Cole said. He stepped aside. He gently guided Owen to the eyepiece. He showed the boy how to turn the small brass wheel to bring the distant ridge into focus. Cole watched him, the sharp line of the boy's jaw, the intense concentration. It was like looking into a mirror that reached 10 years into the past. "Owen," Cole said quietly. The boy looked up from the glass. Cole looked him right in the eye. He needed the boy to hear this. He needed the boy to carry this for the rest of his life. "I want you to learn something today," Cole said. His voice was firm, sincere. "Something more important than surveying land. The world is going to try to teach you what it means to be a man. It will tell you that a man is loud, that he takes what he wants, that he rules over women. The world is wrong. Owen listened. He didn't fidget. He gave Cole his full attention. The true measure of a man, Cole continued, speaking the words clearly into the cold morning air, is his ability to respect women as his absolute equals. You watched your mother fight a whole town last night. She won because she demanded her human rights. You must never look down on a woman. You must never think her labor is worth less than yours. Equality is not a favor you grant to people. It is the law of God and human decency. Do you understand me? Owen looked at the farmhouse. He looked back at Cole. My mother built the irrigation ditch, Owen said proudly. She can lift 100 pounds of feed. Yes, she can, Cole smiled. She is the bravest human being I have ever known. Treat every woman you meet with that same respect. I will, Owen said. Good, Cole said. He patted the boy's shoulder. Just once, a solid grounding touch. Now grab that wooden stake, walk 50 paces toward the creek. Stop when I raise my hand. They worked for 3 hours side by side, the man and the boy, driving stakes into the hard Montana dirt. Around noon, Nora walked out from the house. She carried a tin pail of fresh water and 2 tin cups. The wind blew her hair across her face. She walked with the easy, measured stride of a woman who owned the ground beneath her boots. Cole wiped the sweat from his neck. He walked over to meet her at the fence line. Owen took a cup of water and ran off toward the barn to check on the horses. He left them alone. Nora handed Cole the other cup. He drank it fast. The water was ice cold. It tasted like sweet iron. You didn't have to come out here and do this, Nora said. She looked at the iron stakes driven perfectly straight along the ridge. Yes, I did, Cole said. He handed the cup back. I'm making the map match the reality. Nobody will ever question this boundary again. Nora leaned against the wooden fence post. She looked out over the wheat field. Thank you, Cole, she said. Her voice was soft, but it wasn't fragile. For what you did last night, in the church. You put your career on the line. You saved this farm. Cole shook his head. He leaned against the fence beside her. I didn't save the farm, Nora, Cole said. You saved it. You forced the town to listen. You forced me to see the truth. I just finally did my job. Silence fell between them. It was a comfortable silence, but it was heavy with the weight of the last 10 years. Nora turned her head. She looked at him. I need to say something, Nora said, and I need you to listen to me as Cole, not as the commissioner. I'm listening. 10 winters ago, Nora began, I would have given anything for you to ride up to my porch. I was young, I was terrified, I thought my life was over. I wanted you to come and rescue me. Cole looked down at his boots. The guilt still sat heavy in his gut. But you didn't come, Nora said. I know why now. I forgive my father and I forgive you. But the truth is I had to walk through the fire alone. And because I walked through it alone, I learned how to survive. She reached out. She rested her scarred hand flat against the top rail of the fence. I am not that terrified girl anymore, Nora said. Her voice was absolute steel. I don't need a protector. I don't need a man to shield me from the world. I own this land. I run this farm. I am my own master. Cole looked at her hand on the wood. He saw the strength in her knuckles. I know, Cole said. I need to know that you know, Nora pressed. She looked him dead in the eye. If you are trying to step in here and take over, if you think you owe me protection because of what happened 10 years ago, stop. I will not trade Silas Pratt's control for yours. I will not surrender my independence to anyone, not even to you. Cole didn't flinch. He met her gaze. He let her see all the way down to his soul. Nora, Cole said quietly. I didn't come back to take over. I didn't come back to rescue you. You are the strongest person I know. You don't need saving. He took off his hat. He held it by the brim. I stayed in Harlan Creek because I finally found an equal, Cole said. I want to stand beside you, not in front of you, not above you, beside you. If you tell me to ride out of here right now, I will get on my horse and you will never see me again. But if you let me stay, I just want to walk the same piece of earth with you." Nora searched his face. She was looking for a lie. She was looking for the arrogant pride of a cowboy. She didn't find it. She only found a man. A man who had finally learned how to listen. A slow, genuine smile touched the corners of Nora's mouth. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile since Tennessee. It took his breath away. "The water trough needs fixing," Nora said. She looked back out over the wheat. "The horses are kicking the boards loose. You own a hammer?" Cole smiled, a deep, chest-aching smile. "I own a hammer," Cole said. "Good," Nora said. She picked up the tin pail. "Dinner is at sundown. Wash your hands before you sit at my table." She turned and walked back to the house. Cole stood at the fence. He watched her go. He took a deep breath of the mountain air. 10 winters was a long time to be cold. But the spring had finally arrived. A month passed. The territory moved slow. But eventually, a rider came up the trail. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The mail rider carried a thick, wax-sealed envelope from the Central Land Office in Billings. He handed it to Nora right on her front porch. He tipped his hat and rode away. Nora stood on the porch. She held the envelope in both hands. It was heavy. The parchment was thick. She didn't open it right away. She walked into the kitchen. She sat down at the table. She laid the envelope flat on the wood. She stared at it. Owen was at school in town. Cole was out in the south pasture, mending a section of wire. She was alone. Nora broke the wax seal. She slid the heavy paper out. She unfolded it carefully. It was the deed. There were no complex legal clauses. There were no stipulations about a male guardian. There was just the official stamp of the United States government. And right in the center, written in dark, flowing black ink, were 3 words: Nora Elizabeth Calloway. Not the widow Calloway. Not the estate of Edmund Calloway. Her name. Her identity. Cemented into the history of the Montana Territory. Nora ran her callous thumb over the ink. She didn't cry. Crying was for grief. This wasn't grief. This was something entirely different. It was a deep, quiet settling of her soul. She had fought the earth. She had fought the law. And she had won. But winning wasn't enough. Nora folded the deed. She put it in her cedar chest. She closed the lid. She realized something in that quiet kitchen. She had survived because she was stubborn. She had won because she kept meticulous records. But there were other women in Harlan Creek. Women who were just as tired. Women who were working just as hard. Women who didn't know the law and didn't know their own strength. Nora wasn't going to let another Silas Pratt steal from them. 2 weeks later, Nora opened her home. She didn't announce it in the town square. She just spoke to Mari Tuck. And Mari spoke to the women she delivered babies for. On a Saturday afternoon, 3 wagons pulled into the Calloway farm. 7 women stepped down. Some were young, newly married, looking exhausted. Some were older, their faces weathered by the relentless wind. They looked nervous. They weren't used to gathering for anything other than a church service or a funeral. Nora welcomed them. She didn't serve them tea in the parlor. She brought them out to the big wooden table on the back porch. She had her ledgers laid out, she had blank notebooks, and she had pencils. "Sit down," Nora told them. Her voice was warm, but it was strictly business. The women sat. They looked at the blank books. "We are not here to gossip," Nora began. She stood at the head of the table. "We are here to learn. The men in this town think we are only good for cooking meals and raising children. They think we don't understand the business of survival. I am going to teach you how to prove them wrong." She picked up a pencil. She handed it to a young woman named Sarah, who had just lost her husband to a mining accident. I want to make something very clear to all of you, Nora said, making eye contact with every woman at the table. We are going to teach each other how to farm better, how to manage crops. But more importantly, we are going to learn the law. We are learning how to be free. Nora leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. You must understand your inherent value, Nora instructed them, her voice ringing with clarity. A woman's worth is not defined by the man she marries. It is not defined by her father. You are independent human beings. You have the fundamental right to own property, to sign contracts, and to direct your own lives. If you do not know the law, corrupt men will use the law against you. Education is your shield, equality is your right. But you have to claim it. The women stared at her. No one had ever spoken to them like this. Not their fathers, not their husbands, not the Reverend. Now, Nora said, tapping the blank notebook in front of Sarah. Open that book. I am going to show you how to track the yield of a winter wheat crop. And after that, I am going to show you how to read a territorial tax form. Pick up your pencils. Slowly, hesitantly, the women picked up the pencils. By the end of the afternoon, they were talking loud. They were asking questions. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a sharp, burning spark. The ripple effect had begun. Late that afternoon, after the wagons had rolled away, Nora was sweeping the porch. She heard a horse approaching. She looked up. Lars Eriksson rode into the yard. Lars was a big man, a Scandinavian farmer with a thick beard and shoulders like boulders. He was the man who had signed the false affidavit for Pratt. He was the man who had looked away when she needed help. Lars didn't ride all the way up. He stopped near the gate. He dismounted. He took off his hat. He walked toward the porch slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. Nora stopped sweeping. She held the broom handle. She waited. Lars stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He crushed the brim of his hat in his massive hands. He couldn't look her in the eye at first. He looked at the dirt. Mrs. Calloway, Lars said. His voice was a low, shameful rumble. Mr. Eriksson, Nora replied. Cold, polite. Lars finally looked up. His eyes were red. I came to apologize, Lars said. He didn't make excuses. He didn't talk about Pratt threatening him. He just laid it bare. I did a coward's thing. I signed a paper that was a lie. I tried to steal the bread out of your son's mouth. I did it because I was afraid of the board, but mostly I did it because I didn't respect you. Nora listened. She didn't interrupt. I watched you at the church, Lars continued. His voice shook slightly. I listened to what you said, and I realized something terrible about myself. I thought because you were a woman it wouldn't matter if you lost the land. I thought you belonged in town, working in a kitchen. I stripped you of your humanity in my own mind just to make my cowardice easier to swallow. He took a step closer, looking right at her. You taught me a lesson about human dignity, Mrs. Calloway, Lars said. A hard lesson. Every person has the right to the sweat of their own brow. Equal respect isn't just a word. It's the only way a town survives. I wronged you. I violated your rights. I am deeply, truly sorry. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. He reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch. I want to pay for the lumber to fix your north barn, Lars said, holding out the pouch. It's not enough, but it's a start. Nora looked at the big broken man. She didn't hate him. The frontier was hard. It made people do desperate, cowardly things. But he had stood up. He had admitted his failure. He had learned the lesson. Nora stepped down off the porch. She reached out and took the leather pouch. I accept your apology, Lars, Nora said. Her voice was steady and forgiving. And I accept the lumber. But I don't want you to just pay me. Lars looked confused. What do you want me to do? I want you to go home, Nora said. And I want you to look at your wife and your daughters. And I want you to teach them exactly what you just told me. Teach them they are equal. Teach them to never let a man tell them they cannot hold a deed. You do that, and the debt is settled." Lars nodded slowly. The relief washed over his face. "I will do that, Nora," Lars said. "I swear it." He put his hat back on. He walked back to his horse. He rode away, sitting a little straighter in the saddle. Nora walked back up the steps. The sun was going down. The sky over Harlan Creek was turning a deep bruised purple, giving way to gold. Cole walked out from the barn. He carried a heavy coil of wire over his shoulder. He saw Nora standing on the porch, watching the sunset. He walked up and stopped beside her. He dropped the wire on the deck. "Was that Erickson?" Cole asked. "It was," Nora said. "Did you shoot him?" Nora smiled. She bumped her shoulder against Cole's arm. "No," Nora said quietly. "I didn't shoot him. I think he finally learned how to stand up straight." They stood there together. The commissioner who walked away from his ambitions, the widow who had rewritten the law. They looked out over the fields of winter wheat. The land was hard, the winters were brutal, but the foundation was finally solid. And it was theirs, equal and true. The wind off the northern ridge had teeth. It was November. The kind of cold that warned you to finish your business and get inside. Winter was coming to the Montana Territory. Cole Hargrove sat in the dusty office above the general store. The room was mostly empty. He had packed his saddlebags. He had boxed up his ledgers. Silas Pratt was sitting in a federal holding cell in Billings, waiting for a judge. The Harlan Creek Settlement Board was effectively dismantled. Cole's job here was done. On the center of his desk sat a letter. It was written on heavy cream-colored parchment. It carried the official seal of the territorial governor. It was a promotion. They wanted him in Billings. They wanted him to run the central land office. It meant a massive salary. It meant a house in the city. It meant political power. 10 years ago, when he was a heartbroken cowboy with empty pockets, he would have killed for a letter like this. He would have framed it. He stared at it now. It just looked like a piece of paper. He thought about the men in Billings, the men who wrote the laws, the men who sat in warm rooms and decided that women like Nora Calloway didn't have the intellect to own the dirt they bled on. Cole reached for his pen. He dipped the steel nib into the black inkwell. He didn't write a long, polite reply. He didn't thank the governor for the opportunity. He simply wrote one sentence across the bottom of the heavy parchment. "I resign my commission." He signed his name. He left the letter on the desk for the mail rider. He picked up his hat. He walked out the door. He didn't look back. He rode out to the Calloway farm. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray. The winter wheat had been harvested. The fields were resting. The whole world felt quiet. When he rode into the yard, he saw Nora. She was out by the barn. She was chopping firewood. She wore a heavy canvas coat. She swung the heavy iron axe with an easy, practiced rhythm. The wood split with a sharp, echoing crack. She didn't look like a woman who needed a man to survive the winter. She looked like the winter itself. Cole tied his horse to the fence. He walked up to the woodpile. Nora buried the axe blade into the chopping block. She let go of the handle. She wiped her brow with the back of her glove. She looked at him. "You're not wearing your suit," Nora noted. "I'm not," Cole said. "The mail rider said you were leaving for Billings today." "The mail rider talks too much," Cole replied. He stepped closer. The cold wind whipped between them. "I resigned my commission, Nora," Cole said. His voice was steady. He didn't say it like he wanted a medal. He just stated a fact. "I turned down the promotion. I am staying in Harlan Creek." Nora studied his face. Her eyes were sharp, searching. "Why?" she asked. "Because Billings is full of politicians," Cole said. "And I found out I don't have the stomach for it anymore. I'm going to open a small law practice here in town. I'm going to help the homesteaders draft their wills. I'm going to make sure the board never steals another acre from anyone." Nora didn't smile. She crossed her arms over her chest. "Did you assume I wanted you to stay?" Nora asked. It wasn't a cruel question. It was an honest one. "I didn't assume anything," Cole said. "I don't have the right to assume anything when it comes to you. I made the choice for myself. because this is where I want to be. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the barn she had rebuilt. I know you don't need me, Nora, Cole said. He looked back into her eyes. I know you can run this farm alone. I know you can raise Owen alone. You've proven it to the whole territory. I'm not asking to take over. I'm just asking if I can stay nearby. Nora looked at him for a long time. The silence stretched out. Then she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him. Cole took it. He unfolded it. It was a legal document, but it wasn't drafted by the territory. It was written in Nora's neat, slanted handwriting. Read it, Nora said. Cole read the heading. Partnership Agreement, the Calloway Homestead. He looked up at her, confused. If you're going to stay, Nora said, her voice clear and absolute, we are going to do this right. I want you to go into town with me tomorrow. We are going to see Reverend Aldgate. The next morning, the church office was warm. A small iron stove burned in the corner. Reverend Aldgate sat behind his heavy oak desk. He looked between Cole and Nora. He looked down at the document they had placed in front of him. He pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. I must admit, I am confused, Reverend Aldgate said gently. You both intend to live under the same roof. You intend to raise young Owen together. You clearly care deeply for one another. But you are asking me to witness a business contract, not a marriage license. Nora sat up straight in her chair. She didn't look nervous. She looked like a woman who had spent 10 years figuring out exactly how the world worked. Reverend, Nora began, I want to be very clear about why we are doing this, and I want you to understand the educational reality of the law as it stands today. Aldgate folded his hands. I am listening, Nora. Under the current territorial laws, Nora explained, speaking slowly, emphasizing the weight of the injustice, when a woman signs a standard marriage certificate, she is legally erased. It is called coverture. Her legal identity is entirely swallowed up by her husband's. If I marry Cole traditionally, the law dictates that my farm becomes his farm. My money becomes his money. I lose the right to sign contracts. I lose the right to independently own the very dirt I bled on. Nora tapped her finger on the desk. I fought too hard to exist, Reverend, she stated. I fought an entire town to prove my humanity. I will not let a piece of paper kill my legal identity. The law demands that a woman surrender her autonomy in exchange for a wedding ring. We refuse to participate in that theft. The Reverend looked shocked. He had never heard it explained so bluntly, so truthfully. He turned to Cole. And you, Mr. Hargrove, you are a man of the law. You agree to this? Cole didn't hesitate. I insist on it, Reverend, Cole said. His voice was firm, resonant. Nora is entirely right. The laws of marriage in this territory are fundamentally flawed. They treat women as second-class citizens. They treat wives as dependents or worse, as property. A man's pride should never cost a woman her freedom. Cole leaned forward. He looked the Reverend right in the eye. True love requires true respect, Cole stated clearly. And true respect means recognizing absolute equality. I do not want to own Nora. I do not want to be her master. I want to be her partner. This contract guarantees that the farm remains entirely in her name, forever. It protects her rights, and more importantly, it protects her dignity. Reverend Aldgate sat back in his chair. He let out a long breath. He looked at the two of them, a former cowboy who had learned how to lay down his ego, a widowed mother who had learned how to wield her own power. It is highly unorthodox, Reverend Aldgate said softly. It is just, Nora replied. The Reverend smiled faintly. He picked up his pen. It is the most honest, decent thing I have ever witnessed in this room, the Reverend said. He signed his name at the bottom as the legal witness. He slid the paper across the desk. Nora signed it first. Her hand was steady. She handed the pen to Cole. He signed his name right beside hers. Not above it. Not below it. right beside it. Equal ink, equal weight. They walked out of the church together. They didn't hold hands, they walked shoulder to shoulder, equals. 2 weeks later, mid-November, the snow had finally come. It fell thick and heavy, covering the Montana plains in a blanket of blinding white. Inside the Callaway barn, it was warm. The air smelled of sweet alfalfa hay, leather, and horses. A single kerosene lantern hung from a wooden beam. It cast a rich golden circle of light in the center aisle. Cole was standing by the second stall. He was trying to fix a broken iron latch on the gate. The metal was cold. His fingers were stiff. Nora stood beside him. She was holding the lantern steady. She wore a heavy wool sweater. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of 10 years ago. It was the easy, comfortable silence of two people who knew exactly where they stood. The heavy front doors of the barn creaked open. The wind howled for a second. Snow blew across the dirt floor. Then the doors were pushed shut. Owen walked into the lantern light. He was wearing a thick wool coat and a knit cap pulled low over his ears. His nose was red from the cold. His hazel eyes darted from Cole to his mother. He held his hands behind his back. Cole stopped working on the latch. He looked at the boy. They had been living under the same roof for a few weeks now. They ate dinner at the same table. But they had been careful. Cole hadn't pushed. He hadn't demanded to be called father. He knew that trust wasn't something you could legislate. Trust was something you had to build, day by day. Owen walked up to the stall. He stopped a few feet away from Cole. He brought his hands out from behind his back. He was holding a pair of heavy iron fencing pliers. "You left these by the woodpile," Owen said. His voice was quiet. Cole looked at the pliers. Then he looked at the boy's face. That stubborn brow, that sharp, observant stare. Cole reached out. He took the heavy iron tool. As he took it, his large, calloused hand brushed against Owen's small, cold fingers. "Thank you, son," Cole said. His voice was barely a whisper. Owen didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He just nodded his head. "You're welcome," Owen said. The boy turned around. He walked over to the water trough. He picked up a wooden mallet and started breaking the thin layer of ice that had formed on the top of the water, just like his mother had taught him to do every winter. Cole stood completely still. He held the cold iron pliers in his hand. He felt a lump rise in his throat, so thick and heavy he couldn't swallow. He looked over at Nora. She was still holding the lantern, but she was looking at him. She was smiling. It wasn't a polite smile. It was a real, deep smile that reached all the way up into her eyes. It was a smile that said she had seen the whole journey, from the porch in Tennessee to the church in Harlan Creek to this quiet barn in the dead of winter. Cole looked down at the dirt floor. 10 winters. He had waited 10 winters in the cold. He had lost his youth. He had lost his faith in people. He had thought the world was nothing but broken promises and stolen letters. But standing there in the lantern light, listening to the sound of his son breaking ice, and looking at the woman who had fought the whole world just to exist, Cole realized something profound. He hadn't lost everything. He had just taken a very long time to find his way home. He turned back to the broken latch. He raised the pliers, and side by side in the quiet warmth of the barn, they went back to work. This is a story about courage, dignity, and the unbreakable spirit of a mother who refused to be erased. It reminds us that true strength is not given. It is forged through struggle and truth. Welcome to a channel that brings you stories of the Wild West, of cowboys, love, motherhood, humanity, and compassion between people. The lesson here is simple. Equality is not granted, it is claimed. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more powerful stories like this.
As the dust settles over Harlan Creek and the long Montana winter begins to whisper across the plains, what remains is not just a victory of land, but a victory of truth. Nora Calloway did more than defend a farm. She defended the very idea that a human being's worth cannot be measured by outdated laws, by gender, or by the opinions of men who never lifted a hand to build what they claimed to control. She stood in the face of injustice not with violence, not with bitterness, but with something far more powerful: truth, resilience, and unwavering dignity. This story reminds us that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is found in the quiet determination to wake up before dawn, to keep working when no one is watching, and to stand your ground when the entire world tells you to step aside. Nora's strength was not given to her. It was earned, forged through hardship, loss, and sacrifice. And in that process, she became something greater than a survivor. She became a force that changed the people around her, a spark that awakened a community, and a voice that could no longer be ignored. But beyond the struggle for justice, there is something even deeper here, a lesson about equality and respect. The story challenges a truth that still echoes beyond the frontier, that equality is not something to be granted by authority, but something inherent in every human being. Nora did not ask for permission to be equal. She proved it through her actions, her labor, and her unwavering belief in her own worth. And in doing so, she forced others, not just Cole, not just the town, but all of us, to confront our own assumptions about power, gender, and dignity. There is also a powerful reflection on love, not the kind built on possession or control, but the kind built on understanding and respect. Cole's journey is just as important. He learned that love does not mean stepping in to save someone, nor does it mean claiming a place in their life out of guilt or obligation. True love means standing beside someone as an equal, recognizing their strength, and choosing to walk with them, not ahead, not behind, but side by side. That kind of love does not weaken a person, it strengthens them. And perhaps the most lasting message of all lies in what Nora chose to do after her victory. She didn't simply secure her own future and close the door behind her. She reached out to other women, teaching them, empowering them, and ensuring that what happened to her would not happen again. That is the true mark of strength, not just rising above hardship, but lifting others with you. It is a reminder that real change does not happen in isolation. It spreads, quietly but powerfully, through courage, knowledge, and shared humanity. So what does this story leave us with? It leaves us with the understanding that dignity is not negotiable, that hard work deserves recognition, no matter who performs it, that silence in the face of injustice only allows it to grow, and most importantly, it reminds us that every single person, regardless of their past, their gender, or their place in society, has the right to stand, to be heard, and to own the life they have fought to build. Out here on the frontier, survival was never guaranteed. But respect is something we choose to give, and something we must never take away.